Hi everyone. Now we are starting with the next session by Sukanya. So Sukanya is a senior product security engineer at ServiceNow. In her current role, she performs secure design reviews where she is part of design and development activities and contributes to internal organization training. She has over 6 years of experience in application security engineering. So over to you, Sukanya.
Hello, everyone. This is Sukanya Sukhavasi. So today I'm going to be talking about security by design. But before I dive deep into this, let me introduce a little bit about myself. So I'm a computer science graduate from Purdue University, and I had started my career in cybersecurity as a SOC intern. And then I had transitioned into a full-time path as an application security engineer, where I had an opportunity to peek into some of the red teaming, solving some of the secure code problems, learning security as a application security as a whole, and then I have transitioned into another role where I was an application security engineer as well, where I have been part of learning and contributing to some of the threat modeling exercises, as well as implementing a DevSecOps pipeline internally. And today I am working as a senior product security engineer at ServiceNow. And here I'm spending my time doing secure design reviews and also contributing to internal security trainings, which are helpful to both developers as well as employees as a whole. But other than that, I have been, as a part of my current role, I've been spending some time learning security by design, and it has been a very humbling learning experience as well. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to contribute my share of what I have learned to the world. So yeah, let's dive deep into this one. We're talking about software security and what the traditional approach of software security is, and how we should think of security when it was open as a feature in the agile world. And so I'd be talking about looking at security in another perspective, where we are addressing concerns and not just implementing that feature. So, and how we can categorize those concerns and map it to a particular standard, and defining the design and what alternative approach we could take after going through some of the weaknesses from the traditional approach, and what are the key takeaways, and how to actually, let's look at how to actually bring this change or implement some of the topics we go through today. So the traditional approach to software security. So before we actually talk about the problems, so what is the traditional approach to software security? So let me see if I'm actually recording this one. Okay, cool. So what is the software security traditional approach that I'm talking about before addressing the issues? So let's think of let's take a software project which has different developers, testers, domain experts, if it's a domain-driven model, and who are working around the key requirement of the project. And also it does have some attributes like performance and maintainability and usability and security as a whole, and it does have some kind of priorities that it should hold on to, like quality and time to market is of essence, and you need to stay within a budget, right? But where is security within all this? Where are we fitting in the security as a part of this project? So now the teams have decided to be proactive and add the security features to the backlog. And also some other team members also come up with a good list of security libraries that they can use to tackle some of the vulnerabilities like OWASP, and say. So now after all the initial planning, now the team come together, the project is up and running, and they start implementing. Happens is security we are so focused on what we're working on, it gets in the way. And what happens to the security is it gets the lower priority, right? So now there's not an urgency to go back to that low priority items. And what happens throughout this initial planning phase is security is pushed back, right? Now, this is a hypothetical situation I'm talking about. This is not really very far from the reality, or not really the situation that we have never seen in our experience. So now, after all these steps, when the software is prod ready, what happens is the pen test teams come in, or security audits are kicked off, and when they find or encounter high severity vulnerabilities, the prod deployment is obviously pushed back by weeks or months or even more. So what is another scenario that we can think of? There's also another scenario that where the security review is never conducted, and the project is actually deployed to the production. And what happens? All is well until you find your service making it to those hacker news, right? So again, this is just a hypothetical situation that we're talking about, but what are the problems we are seeing in this approach? Why is that security tasks always getting lower priority compared to other tasks? So we also see that developers are so uninterested in the security itself, because it's not their mistake. They do have some priorities that they have to focus on, and security is not their major focus. And we do not have a specific mandatory step that should be taken place as the testers or the QA team does after the software development step is done. So what is a different approach we can take here? Security mindset. So what is mindset? So a mindset where the focus is more on the design rather than on the security. Since we have seen issues like different issues that we have talked about, we have to tweak our mindset in such a way that we are using a different approach without explicitly thinking about security. We'll look more at it in the next slides. So in order to efficiently and effortlessly create secure software, you need to have a mindset very different from what you might be used to. What you might be used to is in the traditional approach to software security. Now, so now we have talked about security as a feature sitting in our backlog. So what is the security as a feature? So security is addressed as a set of features or user stories, especially in the agile world. Let's look at a simple example. Like let's go back in time and take a house as an example, where the security feature mechanism to outcome. The house should be pretty, but again, while it's not in our hands to control, but we can think of some of the security concerns of just a developer, or instead of just a constructor setting up a strong locking mechanism. So what they have done is just established or constructed a strong locking mechanism and put in place, but really it is the robbery or there's no hardening controls against the robbery. But what's a different approach that we can take here? Security as a model. So why am I calling it as a model? Because the model is actually the representation of the security concerns that we can look at when we do have a security feature. So we are looking at security we are looking beyond security as a feature. So how can we protect against robbery? So there are some concerns that needs to be addressed. And if we are only thinking about the locking mechanism, what if the key is not really stored? What if the key is stored actually just right by the locking, right by the place where the locking is in place? What if the thief just are we defining way how the key should be stored to the lock? So that's one of our concern. What's the other concern? What if the thief enter via any other doors or any other entrances? It's another concern. So we should be looking at the security of the implementation of the garage doors and the windows. And what's another concern is how are we tracking thieves' entrance? While the tracking thieves' entrance is not really going to stop this, we can use this as some kind of a warning, which would warn thief before he enters into the house. So this one is a very straightforward example. So when you implement something as a feature, you're only looking at a job that a particular person has to do. Like the person is only looking at the strong locking mechanism, but there are so many other concerns that should be addressed. And be a better feature. Uh, so the functional focus and the feature focus. Now let's look at an example where there's a project where there's a file system which should have a login page for each user to log in and access their own files and not access anyone else's files. So now what is the functional feature or the functional focus? As a user, I want to log in so that I can access my uploaded files. And what's the security feature focus? A high quality authentication mechanism that allows customers to trust that their access and communications are safe. So what can we draw from this? Is it just an implementation of the login page? No, it does demand implementing and authentication, which is defined as the process of determining whether someone or something is who they say they are, right? And also the communications are safe. What hits my mind is implementing encryption for the data in transit. So those are the two things I can address as security as a feature from this. But how can we translate this to a model focus that we just talked about, security as a model? What are the concerns that we talked about? It was addressing authentication and data in transit. But what it should actually address, confidentiality. What is confidentiality? I, as a user, do not want my files to be accessed by someone else, and all the security control should be implemented around this. But they have only implemented authentication, right? There was no authorization. Let's look at this. So a user A logs in and he was able to access the list of files that belongs to him. Now there is a link to that file that is belonging to user A, and user B was able to just guess the link, or user B actually logged in and was able to access someone else's file with a vulnerability like indirect object reference, and he was successful in accessing the confidential file of user A. So what was missing was some kind of authorization in place. So if we have addressed this as a confidentiality, we would be looking at both authentication and authorization, and maybe beyond that, based on the function of the application. So this change or this focus would highly impact how we are looking at implementing security features by addressing each concern. But we have a better way to map these concerns, and it is categorized as CIAT, which is confidentiality, integrity, availability, and traceability. So we all know the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the traceability to this is it captures the need for knowing who changed or accessed what data and when, which is more like logging and monitoring, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this. I will leave that to you. So let me go back to the next slide. Now, before we dive deep in, let's understand what is design. So design is it is used very loosely, and it takes on different meanings, right? Depending on whom you talk to and in what context it's being used, and it is extremely important concept in software development. So in this process of developing software, we come across many things, like many steps, like decisions on how to write the code that solves the problems, on or what syntax to use, or what constructs and algorithms apply to this, or how to structure the code, like so many things. Take a simple object-oriented approach, right? You'll make decisions on what your own object model should look like and the interactions between those objects within that model. So everything involved in the software development is part of the design process. That means that domain models, software models, APIs, or design patterns, everything is just as important as the design to the software. Like declarations or if statements, hash tables, like everything. So now, how do we define this? Design is a guiding principle for how a system is built and is applicable in all levels, starting from code to architecture, and it includes all the activities that involves active decision making. Okay, so now continuing the traditional approach to software security we were just talking about. So in the process of developing a software, generally in the traditional approach, multiple writing the code, and also should need to adhere to a checklist like OWASP top 10 web app vulnerabilities, attack vectors, and whatever that can contribute to the security knowledge. But what do you see any weaknesses here? What are some of the weaknesses of this approach? So there are a number of weaknesses to this approach, right? So although we have actually looked at security in the last step and looked at all the vulnerabilities and tried to fix it, we still struggle to create a secure software, correct? It did not still develop the resistance towards harsh reality of the production environments. We still see the same security vulnerabilities in so many breaches over and over again. So let's look at the traditional approach first with an example and how we can use that an alternative approach to improvise that without explicitly thinking about security. So now, so let's talk about the simple domain object, which represents the user in a typical web application, where the username is displayed on any page. So this user, it is quite simple, and it just holds an ID and a username. And you can see it's quite representative of the code one might see. It is a very straightforward user class. And next one. So now what happens is that a team member does the testing and he sees the problems, he goes back to the developer and the developer works on fixing it, correct? So you see, so before I actually come back to what are the security issues that you see here? Any string values can be passed on to the username, and that could lead to any attacks like XSS if you inject some kind of script like this. And later the username is displayed on the web page and application, which could lead to some alert box, which could lead to some more weaknesses like user class input validation. So you have this, and a developer tries to, now a developer wants to mitigate this, correct? What happens is we are explicitly, so in this approach, we are explicitly introducing security focused input data validation. So what we are doing here is we are trying to implement a web app filter that validates all posted form data in the web application and also checks that it doesn't contain any malicious codes. Additionally, we are also doing this extra validation, which checks that none of the constructor parameters are null. So we are just trying to improvise the validation here with this additional step. So we're checking the parameters are null. We are validating the input doesn't have any vulnerable code that is susceptible to XSS. But what are the problems that we are seeing? So saying that developers needs to actively think about security while coding is obviously going to conflict with that focus, right? They cannot think of security vulnerabilities. They do have higher priority items about that. And if the developers are really not the experts, if they are not skilled in security, the software they are creating is only going to be as secure as how capable they are in terms of the in terms of the knowledge of the security domain to have. And the person writing the code should think of every potential vulnerability, right? So they need to think about for a developer to actually implement some of the countermeasures for the issues they find. They have to be knowledgeable in all the latest which is very difficult for them to do with the evolving attack surface today. So this approach does have like so many shortcomings that should be taken care of with the alternative approach that I will be looking at in the further slides. So what is the alternative approach? So the alternative approach here is the security by design. We are using the design as a starting point to so many things that can be addressed, like creating the secure code, all the shortcomings that we have seen, like with the developers, and where also developers are not really constantly and explicitly thinking about security, which is going to be a win-win for both business as well as the security teams. So how can we make this class secure? So now we have just looked at the user class and uh, what are different ways that we can use to meet some of these requirements are secure by design. So we have to know and meet our domain experts. So we have for us to understand a true meaning of the username in the context of our application, domain and username, what is a valid length, and ask questions about how it is going to look like instead of looking for the characters to exclude. Like, you don't want to know if the script tags are excluded or if any special characters are excluded, right? You have to know what should actually look like to better address your understanding with a security by design. Now, so in this example, so this is the user class with domain constraints. So the domain constraints are nothing but the domain constraint, nothing but where we are addressing this user class with the domain invariants, which is going to validate input at the time of creation. So the domain invariants are nothing but the policies or the conditions we are setting across, around the username. So now if you see this username class, what we are doing is, uh, so actually there is a lot of logic concerning the username. Since we have now discussed with the domain expert, there is a sign that the username is very important in this domain model. And then we know that it needs, if it needs a separate logic, or the extraction of this logic might obey this principle of high cohesion, which means that keeping parts of the code base that are related to each other in a single place. So we have this, what we have done is there's a user class, and then we have set the domain invariants here, and these are validated directly at the time of creation. So now let's see how this can be tweaked to actually make it more secure, and so that we are actually not explicitly, developers are not explicitly thinking about it. Before we dive deep into that, since I am talking a lot about domain driven design, let's look at some of the terms like domain logic, domain model, entities, value object, and domain primitive. Domain primitive and value objects play a very important role in the approach that we are talking about. So domain logic is nothing but the business logic, which defines the way that the data gets created, stored, and modified. Whereas the domain model is, so domain model is what helps businesses to meet their requirements. It contains all the rules and patterns that will help deal with some complex business logic. And entities. So entity is anything that has a unique identifier, which is a combination of data and behavior. So a user is an entity, or a product with an ID is an entity. But what is a value object? So the key property of this value object is immutability. What is an immutable type? And so value objects are immutable, which means that they cannot be changed once they are created. So actually modifying one of the value objects is really not changing the existing one or discarding the old one. We are actually creating a new one. So we can specify the extinction methods that can assist with the operation that it is associated with, but we are not really but they are really unchangeable. Let me tell you a simple example to better understand the value object. Think of a framework like .NET, and think of the string objects, so built-in string objects in the .NET framework, so which is a very good example of immutable type. So if you convert a string in some manner, such as making it uppercase, it doesn't actually change the original string, but rather creates a new string, right? So value objects, it's a very important concept, and there is a lot that was defined, that are actually explained very clearly by the authors in Secure by Design book. I would highly recommend going back to it and dive deep into that. And let's see what the domain primitive is. So domain primitive is very much similar to value objects. If you take the concept of value object and slightly tweak it while having security in mind, you get something called a domain primitive. So, but what are the advantages of it? So whenever you are creating, whenever you start using domain primitives in your domain model, you will be able to create code with significantly reduced likelihood of security issues, just to the way you're designed, just to the way of designing it. So what happens is, with the domain primitive, the domain object must uphold conditions at the time of creation. So domain primitive enforces the existence of all these domain variants at the time of creation. So if you have a username, and I think I would better explain that in the next slide, but if you have a username class with different domain variants, and if it does exist, it is going to be valid because it is already validated at the time of creation. Let's see that in an example. So domain value objects, if you see, there's also a lot of code going on here. See, here we have extracted the logic of username class, which also encapsulates all the knowledge about username, and also all the domain rules and domain invariants are enforced at the time of creation. If you see, the domain rules are enforced at the time of the creation, and this new object username is indeed a domain primitive. The value object upholds the domain invariants for the username, and sorry, go back. And the user object uses this username domain primitive, and if it does it is always valid if it does exist, which simplifies the security challenge we were thinking about in the before traditional approach scenario. So it is also encapsulating all the knowledge, and it is enforcing the domain rules at the time of creation. So now if you see how a user class is looking like, here a user class is looking, so this is how the user class looks like after extracting the username. So generally the validation of the value object should not take place in the constructor, but constructors generally just take the logic, right? They don't generally include the logic. They just simply assign the values. And if the validation is required, they must be moved to a factory method, like a common pattern to make object values constructors private and provide one or more public static methods for creating the value object. I think that's what we exactly did that here. So this is actually solving many problems we were talking about. So what are the key takeaways? So with the design focus, you were able to find out more about the details surrounding the username. It is also letting you create a precise domain model for you. We also thought of concepts within current domain. So I think we have gained a deeper understanding of the domain after meeting with the domain experts. And this also helped us protect against excesses, because if a malicious user tries to input this one, it doesn't even work because it is not valid, and the username doesn't work anymore. So we have paid close attention to the concepts within the current domain, and we also understood how important the username is and decided to also extract into their own objects. So we should be able to gain some of the understanding of what is applicable to the context of the application, and should understand the importance or the key role that it plays in our domain model, and tweak or make some changes according to our scenario. So in our scenario, we haven't even explicitly thought about security, but we have only thought about username and how it should look like, and what is going to make it valid if it exists. So that is a very main key takeaway for us. Without even explicitly thinking about security, we have started thinking about security only at the domain primitive level with the help of value objects. So what are the advantages? So software design is very central to the interest and competence of many of the developers, who make secure by design concepts easy to adapt. So it becomes very natural in the part of the software development developers do not, I mean, any security domain knowledge is not actually demanded for the software developers to pursue, right? And with this approach, we are also addressing business concerns as well as security concerns, and how they are actually carrying equal priority throughout the process. And we do have now all the developers who are experts or not experts in the security naturally writing the security code. So this domain focus also is solving security bugs implicitly for us. So by choosing like good domain constraints, all the non-security experts are able to write secure code. So how did we bring this change? So we have talked about the domain-driven design. It has its own advantages, especially in the microservices kind of architecture, and it could really make a difference if we follow that approach in that. And another way to start dealing with the problems of secure coding is starting with secure design reviews. So before even developers completely implement the entire application, what if they come back to security teams and request some kind of assistance with the design reviews? I think it is one approach where the companies are not adapted to domain driven design. This is one approach that anyone could take, and I believe the security teams can contribute a lot in terms of performing security design reviews, and that's what I've been doing by contributing to these exercises. And security teams should also advocate developers on some of these easy approaches that they could take while writing the code, and ask questions, keep asking questions. I believe developers can ask security teams questions, and as well as security teams can go back to developers and ask questions. I think this is how we are going to solve some of the challenges throughout the process we are facing, like we did in the traditional software security approach. So when security experts or when security teams are doing security design reviews, everything is going to come back to them new, right? So I'm sure the research do contribute a lot in terms of doing the security design reviews, and also the learning curve is going to be increasing at a very faster rate if security teams do their own research in order to do the security design reviews, as well as the questions they ask throughout the entire process. And always keep it simple. uh, we have security works only when we make it simple for others we are working with. It is not complicated. It is just the approach we do have in mind and how simple we make it and put it in front of the teams. So this is about the approach that I wanted to present to you from my learning, and I wanted to keep learning and share whatever knowledge I've been gaining and be part of this community. And I thank DiverseCon for giving me this opportunity to do this presentation. I have thoroughly prepared, I've thoroughly actually enjoyed and preparing for the entire presentation. And feel free to let me know if anyone have any questions or any feedback. I would love to hear from the community. You can reach out to me at this email. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you for the great session, and it was really interesting to know about Secure by Design. So, thank you all.